All right. Welcome, everyone, to the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. Thank you so much for joining us. We have three fabulous authors today for the LGBTQ plus representation in YA fantasy panel. I'm Haydee Smith from Mysterious Galaxy Books, and I'd really like to take a moment to welcome our authors and introduce a little bit about them. So first off, we have Erin Grammer. Erin Grammer writes YA fantasy for quirky teens. She graduated from Ohio University with a fine arts degree and is passionate about inspiring young readers. When not writing, she hunts rocks, collects Hello Kitties, and chases one incredible daughter and two cats. Magic Mutant Nightmare Girl is her debut novel. Welcome, Erin. Thank you so much for joining us. Next up, Thank you. Next up, we have TJ Klune, the New York Times and USA Today best-selling Lambda Literary Award author of Into This River, I Drown, The House in the Cerulean Sea, The Extraordinaries, and more. Being queer himself, TJ Klune believes it is important now more than ever to have accurate, positive queer representations in stories. And TJ's latest book is Flashfire, the sequel to The Extraordinaries. Welcome, TJ. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Perfect. And then finally, we have Anna Marie McLemore, born in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains and taught by their family to hear La Llorona in the Santa Ana winds. They are the author of The Weight of Feathers, a finalist for the 2016 William C. Morris Debut Award, the 2017 Stonewall Honor Book, When the Moon Was Ours, which was longlisted for the National Book Award in Young People's Literature and was winner of the James Tiptree Jr. Award, Wild Beauty, Blanca and Roja, Dark and Deepest Red, and The Mirror Season. So welcome, Anna Marie. Thank you so much for joining our fabulous panel here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So welcome, y'all. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I was thrilled to read all of these books, and I really loved how the kind of intersections of queer identity, community, grief, and especially reclaiming joy came across all of these narratives. So to sort of start off our discussion, I was wondering if y'all had anything that you would like our audience to know first about you and or your books.
I'll go ahead and go first, just to break the ice a little bit. Yeah, I'm TJ Klune. I write lots of books, and I write them about queer people because writing about queer people makes me happy, and I think that queer people deserve to see themselves in fiction and also to be able to find happy characters that also happen to be queer. And we don't get that a whole lot, and I think that we need that more and more and more these days.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off that. I totally agree with what TJ says. That's one of the reasons why I write books full of queer characters too. And not just to see them in joyous roles, but I want to see people in, I probably can't swear, just really wild roles, you know, campy, over the top. I want villains, I want sidekicks, I want main characters, I want the whole landscape basically being queer. Because I just think that makes it more fun and there's more chance for people to see themselves and find their favorites.
So when I get asked about what I write, am I echoing? I'm sorry. Am I doing okay on the echo? I'm always checking. Okay. When I'm asked about what I write, I basically write fairy tales that are as queer, Latinx, and non-binary as I am. I love writing queer identity and trans identity into fairy tales because we belong there, and we've been everywhere throughout history. One of my recent books, Dark and Deepest Red, half of it takes place in 1518, and the working title for this book was Medieval Queers because we were there. We have been there throughout history, and that's something that I like to write about, the ways in which we have always found each other and celebrated each other and loved each other.
I love that. And especially going off of the kind of like celebrations and the fact that our community has always been here. I was wondering how y'all settled into developing the passions for the title or for the main characters in each of your books. So for Mirror Season, we have the Pan Dulce for Ciela, we have the costuming and the Harajuku fashion for Holly, and then we have the fan fiction for the Flashfire heroes. So how did y'all start with those?
Well, fan fiction is something that I absolutely adore, and it's something that is very important, I think, to up and coming queer writers, especially because I think fan fiction is a place where queer writers get a chance to hone their voices, and they also get a sense of community in the fact that a lot of these forms of media that they're writing fan fiction about don't necessarily have queer canon characters. And so they have to basically rewrite canon to be able to see themselves in this form of media. And fan fiction is very often unfairly maligned as not being literature. But is there bad fan fiction? Sure. Are there bad books that are published by major publishers? Hell yes, there is. And I think it's important that we recognize that fan fiction isn't a lesser form of literature. It is just as important as the books that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. I just will hop in next. I totally agree with everything that you said about fan fiction, though, and it's such an important space for young writers to, I think, go and explore, to have kind of the foundation of the world building, and then they get to play around with the idea of character, and especially in queerness and identity. I know so many people personally that found their queer identity through fan fiction, and so I think it is such a crucial space to be acknowledged more in the writing community. Absolutely, in the literary community just in general. And I think it's a great compliment when someone says, "Oh, your book reads like fan fiction," you know, because once they devoured it, it was so exciting, fast-paced, you know, kind of a twist of what they were expecting. But I guess speaking of twists, my whole inspiration with Holly and her interest in alternative and hard-to fashion was I really liked, I was kind of brainstorming one day, writing down random ideas, and I loved the thought of having someone who was super pink and super frilly, very spiky and cold and mean, and I guess she shares anxiety with me too. That was another part of my identity that I wrote into her, although her reactions are much different, I think, to her anxiety than mine. But it was also something distinct for me. You know, I love very visual books, so I thought it was interesting to take a real life fashion that I like and that I think is very fascinating to research the history of and how the culture is still evolving today, and to write that into a book. I just thought that it was a cool sort of visual experience while reading.
Absolutely.
So The Mirror Season is my book of pansexuality and pan dulce, and in addition to just like I make everything queer, the reason that's important to Ciela is because these are both things that come from her heart, like the way that she bakes in her family's pastaria for her community and the way she loves. These are both things that are at the core of her, and they're both things that she celebrates and that she has communities that celebrate with her. So it's really like these are two sources of joy for her. And this is a book that's a lot about trauma and processing trauma and how you find your allies, how you reconnect with your community after trauma. And an important part of that narrative is highlighting what brings a character joy, what is at the center of them, and highlighting the fact that their identity is still worth celebrating, no matter what we survive, who we are, what we love, the communities we connect with, they're worth celebrating.
That's beautiful.
Definitely. And what y'all have mentioned here, reclaiming joy, celebrating joy, finding, these kind of wild stories. And, TJ, your book is also billed as, some people are extraordinary and some people are just extra. So I think this sort of excess that can be found in queerness and the way that we celebrate that, how did y'all balance those kinds of exceptionalities and found communities while working with difficult subject matter like neurodivergence and trauma and anxiety?
Well, look, I think the idea of being neurodiverse as the main character in the first book, The Extraordinaries, and in the continuation in Flashfire, he has ADHD. He's like me. And you don't get to see that often, especially in queer characters. In queer characters, we have to be, a lot of times we have to be perfect. And our one big hill that we have to overcome, especially in YA, is coming out. It's not, and there are far greater authors than I who have written some spectacular coming out stories. And I think coming out stories have a place and they're so important especially in YA. But I'm always thinking about, okay, what happens after you come out? Life doesn't stop the first time you come out. As a matter of fact, queer people know that you come out to people for the rest of your life. Everyone new that you meet is someone you're going to have to come out to at some point, especially if they stick around in your life. So I'm not necessarily thinking about coming out. I want to focus on other things, which is why I in the Extraordinaries and in Flashfire, this group of queer kids, Nick and his boyfriend Seth and Jazz and her girlfriend Gibby, they're out, they're proud, they're queer. And there was no angst in their coming out. They have their support group, they have their parents and guardians who love them for who they are. And that way, in that direction, I could focus on things that are important to me at this moment in time. And that is thinking about how 15 or 16-year-old TJ would have felt could he have read a character who was queer and had ADHD. That is something that would have been monumentally life-changing for me, because we didn't get that. I didn't get to see myself in fiction as the slightly effeminate, way too loud kid who never could sit still. Even right now, I'm all jittery just because that's who I am. And I wanted to be able to show that to neurodiverse people out there, that you're not alone, and we're here, and we're loud, obviously, because we're neurodiverse, but we deserve to have a space for ourselves. We deserve to have a seat at the table and to be allowed to tell our stories, because our stories matter.
Yeah. Totally. That's just funny that you say that being neurodivergent, especially sometimes, I think with ADHD it's probably different. It's more of a visual thing for a lot of people, but with anxiety, it's very, I think, hidden thing, and it's something that people feel is shameful. And I think a lot of the ways there are people who feel the same way about their queer identity. So I had my whole cast, basically Holly is bi and she has social anxiety, but it's something that she grapples with basically every single sentence of the book. You're very deep in her brain, and it's, oh, I'm scared of this interaction, so I'm making up stories that make it fit into my world, into my narrative that keeps me safe, because it's very scary. And I think there's a lot of ways that queerness intersects with that in a lot of ways, especially like TJ was saying with the coming out thing. You're always looking around, I think, to see where you're safe and where you fit in. And I think books with characters that are just out already, and this is another thing that TJ was saying, that it's those spaces for the young kids now who are reading, where my main cast of characters, I think everyone that has a name, basically, or more than a paragraph worth of lines, is queer. And they all talk about it. And it's just one of the things that is just completely normal. It's like, no one bats an eye, basically. It's like, oh yeah, this is just the way that it is. And that was almost something that I wanted to put in my world, too, was that coming out and queerness is not something that becomes an issue. And I guess maybe, I don't think it should be ever, but it definitely shouldn't be when the world is basically imploding around you. You know, that there's no time for any coming out angst when you have a world to save.
So since we're talking about neurodivergence, I've been thinking about this a lot. My next book that comes out in March 2022, that's called Lakelore, is about two Latinx non-binary teens. They both use they/them pronouns. They're both neurodivergent. One of them has ADHD. One of them is dyslexic, and they both have different paths that they have to take on the road of, like, I can be this many things. I am this many things. Like, the world may want you to limit your identity to a certain extent. There may be pressure on you from the world to make your identity more consumable for other people, but that's never going to be the path that makes that gives enough space for you. And I think this is something that came up in a lot of my books, and came up in the Mirror season, because this is Ciela's a girl who's queer. She's pansexual. She's Latina. She's mixed race, and getting to a point where you can claim the identities you have and the space that takes up. It's not just an act of courage. It's an act of compassion for yourself. And it's an act of giving the compassion to yourself that so many of us already give to others in our community. And I think that's so much of what the queer and trans and non-binary community is about It's so often you can see something beautiful in someone else and they can see it in you before you can see that same thing in yourself. And that's something I think a lot about in terms of intersectional identity, because whenever there's pushback about how many identities there are in a story, a lot of us live that. Like, a lot of us are that. Like, that's our real life experience. So having that be something that's wonderful and normalized on the shelves, that's something that I have this heart for doing. I have this passion for doing in my books, whether it's a queer Latina girl, whether it's a non-binary character with a disability. I just want that to be normal, because we are here, that we live intersectional identities all the time.
This is just something that, Anna Marie, I just thought of this. Like you're saying, there's no such thing as too many intersections in a character. There are real readers out there who will look at that and go, this is me or this is me. And I think books and TJ from your books are amazing. I love becoming such a huge thing, and people are becoming more aware of it.
Excellent. And I think that, this recursive theme of intersectionality and complexity of characters, and y'all mentioned, wanting to put that representation on bookshelves. Do y'all remember maybe like the first time or a striking time that you found like yourself or a facet of yourself represented in like books or popular culture, and it just struck you like, finally, here's something that I can relate to?
Absolutely. When I was 15 years old, this would have been in 1998, 97. I read a book called The Frontrunner by Patricia McLemore. And if you don't know this book was written in the 70s by a straight white woman, and it was one of the first mainstream major books about queer people published by a major publisher. It was scandalous, and it was sensational. It was a bestseller, and I actually got to know the author, Miss Nell Warren, before she passed a few years ago, and she was a delightful, wonderful human being. And the book, The Frontrunner, was the first time I read a book with queer people as the main characters. Now, if you've read The Frontrunner, then you know it is not a happy book. It is a book that, I don't want to say revels in the suffering of the queer characters, but it does not give them a happy ending, and in fact is a tragic ending. And for the time, I assume in the 70s when it was published that it was meant to be shocking. But imagine being a 15, 16-year-old and reading a book for the first time where there's queer characters, and then one of the queer characters is murdered at the end of the book instead of getting a happy ending with the love interest that they've been going through the whole time. I was horrified. I was amazed by the writing and the story itself, but the last 20 pages of the book destroyed me. And it hurt because it kind of went along with the belief that queer people don't get happy endings, that we don't get to fall in love and find joy and find happiness. And Miss Nell Warren went on and wrote, I think, 2 or 3 additional books in that series. And I think that she tried to make up for what happened in the first book. But it still left such an embedded and lasting impact on me that I promised myself right then and there that if I ever got the chance to be an author, my queer characters, no matter what I put them through, would always get a happy ending. And I have been published now for 10 years, and I have stuck by that. And I think that's something that I always stick by, because no matter what type of story I'm writing, whether it be contemporary, whether it be science fiction, fantasy, anything like that, there's going to be 2 things that will always happen. 1, every main character, almost every side character will be queer. And 2, they will get a happy ending.
That's fantastic. It's so funny. I'm sitting here listening to your story, and it's heartbreaking how many stories I feel like that we had growing up where there's this bait and switch, you know, the queer characters going through their lives and they're doing fine, and all of a sudden the train wreck hits them. And that's supposed to be, it almost felt like a morality play of, look, see what happens if you live your queerness. And I think that there's so much work to be done to fix that narrative that I think so many people probably have internalized over the years. And as I'm thinking about what my example would be, I'm going, you know what I really loved, and I still do, and this was a huge influence for Magic Mutant Nightmare Girl, is just the super high femme energy of Sailor Moon. And I thought too about Neptune and Uranus being one of the first really, it's a bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of, oh, they're together, but if you're part of the queer community, if you're a queer kid, you're sitting there watching it going, oh, okay, I get this, I know, you know what I mean? And I think that sort of, it's subtle if you're not queer, but if you are queer, I think it's life-changing. It's so exciting. It's this big, shiny beacon of I can be out in ways, you know, I can live my life and I can be a hero. And I think that's important to write into books, you know, to not give people the train wreck endings, but to allow them to go through their lives, you know, with the highs and with the lows and with the hardships, but still come out, you know, on the other end, looking gorgeous, fighting evil by daylight, you know, just doing their best. And that's sort of my thing. I want to write books like that too. I think it's really important to show the spectrum of queer lives, that there is joy and there is sadness, and it's not one or the other. And being queer doesn't make it so that you're going to be boxed in to hurting. There's so much joy to be had, and there's so much joy that you can find. And it's just really important, I think, for me to show basically, even there's suffering, but there's also happiness. There's both.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to give an answer that a lot of us have, which is Ash by Malinda Lo. That was a transformative book for me, and I think was part of what woke up my queer fairy tale heart. It was one of those books where I thought I didn't know this was allowed to be on shelves, and just to know that there was a queer author of color writing these kinds of stories, it made me feel like I existed in a way that I didn't realize I didn't feel until I saw that, and until I got to see that. And in a similar way, I felt reading Like Water for Chocolate or reading Passing by Nella Larson. Little pieces of me sort of got woken up at different times, I think, going back to intersectional identity. And that book was such a moment in my life as a reader. I fanboyed forever when they asked me to blurb the 10th anniversary edition. I can like barely talk about it. Just knowing that we're this idea of books showing us what we're allowed and showing us what our lives can be, which might sound a little bit strange in a fantasy novel, but I think fantasy novels, science fiction, fantasies, speculative fiction, show us what's possible in through magic, through what the endings are, through what kind of lives we're allowed to have. And I think every single genre shows us truth and shows us what's possible for us in a different way.
Wonderful. In the spirit of possibility, if you could take one of your side characters and give them like a spin-off or maybe even just a short story, just expand a little bit more of their lives, do you know who you would pick and why?
Absolutely. In Flashfire, there is a drag queen superhero who I will not name here because their name is kind of a secret, and I am super excited for people to get to it. But I love drag queens. I love drag culture. I have such respect for everyone who can put themselves out there like that. And when I was a very baby Twinkie queer at the age of 18 with my fake ID going into my first gay bar and seeing my very first drag show, it was, I don't know, it was one of those moments in a queer person's life that felt transformative for me. And I can never do it because I do not look good in dresses or anything along those lines, but I have such an admiration and respect for drag queens and drag culture, and so I have a drag queen superhero in my book that I'm very excited for people to meet, and I would love to be able to write more on.
Awesome.
That's so cool. I'm even more excited now. That's awesome for the book. I think in mine, this is such an interesting thought because it's a YA book, but I would probably write the spinoff for the oldest character. I'd probably write Dr. Laura's story because I think it would have to be an adult book. I think it'd be a bit like Cruella because what happens, I have this backstory in my head for her basically, when she is the daughter of immigrants who grew up in the South. Her parents worked for NASA, and then she became a molecular biologist, and sort of her going through life, what eventually led her to work for a secret research facility that's not exactly good aligned. I mean, anyone making super soldiers, I think, has to have that sort of evil switch within them, you know, that if you have to push this button, if you have to make a hard decision, you could do it. And I think, too, that because I know that she worked basically for her full life, and I'm a workaholic, too, I can kind of, you know, relate to that. There's this sort of dynamic that, you know, in Magic Mutant Nightmare Girl, that she recently lost her long-term girlfriend. There's a brief conversation about it, and I think it would be interesting to explore the dynamic that I've tried to weave in with the found family, that she stayed for the 3 boys in the lab, that has basically become her family. She lost her chance at love to stay for the love that she's already got, even though she hasn't really integrated that as the whole core idea of family yet. So, I don't know. I'd write her story because I think she's super interesting.
So I think I'm going to pick a character from this book, Wild Beauty. I think I'm going to pick Babe Breyer, who's my non-binary heartthrob. Like heartthrob to the point that okay, this book is about the Noma Vida's cousins, who are 5 queer Latina girls who grow these enchanted gardens. And at the beginning of the book, they all realize that they are in love with Babe Breyer. Because I had this thing where I love writing trans and non-binary heartthrobs, like, because that is not the story I saw growing up. I saw, like, as discussed, I saw a lot of stories of heartbreak. So having this character who just does like whatever she wants to do, whose gender she expresses in whatever way she wants to, when she wants to, I think I could have a lot of fun, like writing her story and writing what some of her history with these enchanted gardens is.
So with the narratives, whether you're working on a series or if you're retelling fairy tales or sort of like superhero tropes, what do you find most challenging or rewarding to work within kind of like a structured narrative, to make it your own, to queer it, to reclaim things that might have been excluded from other communities?
Yeah, so everybody, I mean, if you're a comic book nerd, especially if you're a queer comic book nerd, you understand that superheroes are essentially queer coded. They are people who had to hide their identities for the rest of the world because the rest of the world might have feared who they actually were. And so growing up, you know, aside from having a ridiculously, probably unhealthy obsession with Wolverine, I loved the idea of wearing a mask and being super, and people not knowing who you were, and you could still go do whatever you wanted to do. And for a long time, the idea of being neurodiverse, having ADHD, felt like chains holding me down. It felt like a deficit. When you're a kid and you have an otherness about you, it makes you feel like you're set apart from your peers and that you can't relate to them. And something I think that a lot of people don't realize, because I hear it all the time, is that when you're a kid with ADHD, you become a teenager with ADHD who becomes an adult with ADHD. It doesn't cure. You don't get cured as you get older. It doesn't ever really go away. It can become more manageable, but it doesn't ever really go away. And I hear that all the time. Oh, don't you grow out of it? Isn't that something that's, you know, the older you get, the easier it gets? And no, not really. I have good days and I have bad days. But that otherness always felt like it was something that I didn't want, that I hated. I hated that part of myself. I did. But the older I've gotten, you know, there's the mantra or I should say the adage that sometimes goes on with people with ADHD is that it's our superpower because nobody thinks like we do. And I think that is a good way to put it. And it goes along with the idea of queerness, and it goes along the idea with these comic characters that hide themselves from the world, but they're still able to be super. They're still able to be extraordinary. And that's all I ever wanted to be, was extraordinary. And I got to grow up and do what I do now. And I think that I hope that counts for something.
Cool. Erin, Anna-Maria.
Go ahead, Anne-Marie. I always feel like I'm going second. You go.
I'm very like, it's like when you sit in the same seat over and over again in class. So I'm thinking about this with ADHD too now. I got diagnosed as an adult, so I didn't have that are you going to grow out of it kind of thing. But are you going to grow out of it was like some of the queer narrative, right? Like when is this phase of yours going to be over? Well, like roughly never. The same as the way my brain works. So I'm thinking about that, and that's my brief like neurodivergence tangent before I go off on my Nick Carraway is gay rant. Everybody ready? Okay, so I'm thinking about The Great Gatsby because that's the book I'm working on right now. I'm thrilled to be doing this. Firewall and Friends is doing the Remix Classic series, and they asked me to do The Great Gatsby, and I was like, okay, you know this is going to end up really brown, really queer, really trans, and they were like, yeah, we sort of knew what we were getting into with you. So as I'm going into this story and I'm making it my own, and I'm making it very different, but like a lot of the groundwork is there because like it was there. It was one of those books where I was reading it, and then I was kind of looking around going like, is anyone else seeing what I'm seeing here? Like,
it's so gay.
it's so gay. Like just all these passages about like how beautiful he is, and it was painful to me where I was like, no, I'm wrong, no one else sees this. Okay, so now I'm getting to bring out what I always saw there, and I don't like I'm also getting to bring out what I think is a lot of like parallels to trans identity. Like what are you told that you have to be? What starts to become this prescribed identity that you have to push against? I'm writing both Nick and Gatsby as trans boys. That's why the title is Self-Made Boys, which is like might be the transest title I'm ever going to have, which I'm thrilled about. And bringing out some of what's already there, like looking at the racism that's in the original and letting brown characters have center stage in this story. It's addressing what's already there is also kind of what I bring to fairy tales sometimes, because the undercurrents of queerness, the undercurrents about race often and often about racism are there. The undercurrents about disability are there. We just need to find them and bring them out. And that's the same thing that I'm doing with The Great Gatsby is also what I do with fairy tales. Like what needs to be questioned, what needs to be taken apart, and what needs to be brought forward.
I cannot wait for Gay Gatsby, by the way.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm so hyped now.
I'm having a lot of fun with it. Daisy is an angry Latina lesbian socialite.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. I'm still stuck to Jen, what you said, that all superheroes are queer coded, because like it is so true. Yeah, that is absolutely, that's so interesting. That's a great answer. And I'm going to piggyback off there. Another thing that you, I guess it's more, if you read comic books, you might get some of this. I feel like a lot of times characters are much more fleshed out than if you're just getting into superheroes and, you know, you really like the Marvel movies as a kid or something like that. But a lot of the times we don't get to see superheroes be vulnerable in a way that impacts them even emotionally. And I think one of the things that was most interesting to me in Magic Mutant Nightmare Girl in the whole series, there's going to be 2 more books going forward. It's not necessarily, oh, the powers are so cool, they're flashy, I'm so excited to be a superhero. It's, oh my God, I break everything I touch now, and I literally live in a porcelain china house, and now there are these weird people, and they want to get to know me, and they want to use me to hunt mutants. What do I do? Because I think if you really think about what becoming a superhero would entail, it's a bit horrific in a lot of ways. You would have to get used to your body in an entirely new way, and depending on if it was something that you grew into, or in Holly's case, she gets it very unexpectedly. I think that that's definitely something that would impact you very deeply emotionally, to have this new facet of your identity layered on top of you, and especially if it's one that's unwanted. And then there's also just the added carnage of, basically the reality of living in a superhero world. You might not feel great about having to throw a guy's car through a window where you don't know if there's people inside. So one of the things that I thought was most interesting about writing within sort of a superhero, magical girl type genre was looking at those deep emotional currents, and especially with Holly, someone who's used emotion, no thanks, it goes over here. But it leaks out, and I think there's so much stress that comes with a situation like that, that's sort of a fascinating place to play. And then when you add on top of it, she has this over emotionality basically. So even though any sort of queerness isn't a big deal in this world, there's one scene where she's with these 2 beautiful girls that she knows, and she's trying not to basically just, fall all over the floor and go, oh my gosh, you're so pretty, because now she has this, basically her masking tools are all gone. And in life, but I think in queerness too, there are situations where you're thrown into that if you don't know everyone around you, you might try to put up one face, but what happens when that's no longer something that you're able to do? And I thought those were just fascinating things to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like across the 3 books, there was a lot of discussion of power, vulnerability, and the sort of external forces that act on a person and their relationship to their body. And I was wondering how y'all approached that as you were developing those characters in these narratives, trying to, map that journey. Because, they're adolescents, but then they're also engaging with, like powers, with traumas, with grief. And so how does that sort of reside in the body, and how do they make their way through that in the narratives, and how were you able to sort of work through that in your writing process?
So when you are a 16-year-old queer boy, obviously when you're a teenage boy, everything is turned up to an 11. But when you are a queer boy, I think there's a different sense of heightenedness that goes along with it, especially when you're neurodiverse, especially when, in the case of Nick and Flashfire, you might be developing telekinesis. But it's I don't know. There's points in Nick's life where his body is actively working against him because of his ADHD, which for him leads to panic attacks, which is something that I to this day will still go through. And if you've never had a panic attack before, it's one of those things like when people say, "Oh, don't you grow out of ADHD?" Is that when people are having panic attacks, the common misconception is, "Oh, you just need to breathe through it. You'll get through it. Just relax." That's not how it works, man. That is not how it works. Your body is actively betraying you when you have a panic attack. Your body is fighting against you. You have these vice grips closing on your lungs. Your brain is short-circuiting, and you can't think. And it makes you feel like you're on fire in the middle of a lake filled with ice, and you're being electrocuted all at the same time. And of course you want to breathe through it. Of course you want to stop it. But it has to pass in its own time. And I wanted to show that too, because Nick has panic attacks. His ADHD leads to it because he can get overwhelmed, overloaded, and it can set him off, and he can unfortunately have to go through that. That's a very firm reality for people like us. And I think it's important that we show that, because again, it comes with the idea that the more you talk about something, the less power it has over you. When it comes to, especially when it comes to mental health, especially when it comes to stuff like anxiety, depression, panic attacks, ADHD, we need to destigmatize all of that, because the more we talk about it, the more knowledge we get, the more knowledge we can help spread, and the less power it'll hold over the people that it afflicts.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Anna Marie, would you mind talking a little bit about Ciela and Locke's journey with their relationships to themselves, like coming back to themselves after what they've gone through in the book?
So this is a book about two sexual assault survivors who have very different experiences, but also are able to support each other in the way that survivors do. Like I've talked about, Ciela is a queer Latina girl. Locke is a white straight, and for Locke, he has to be willing to engage with other survivors, and specifically like survivors who are boys, who are going to be able to talk to him about like what this means and what it doesn't mean, and to be able to talk yourself out of some of the lies that you've been told. And that happens with trauma, that happens with identity, like these lies that we take on board that we have to then unlearn, and that we have to help each other unlearn. That's something that's important in claiming ourselves, and that's something that's important in the path forward from trauma. So that's part of Locke's journey, is like just the idea that like you are not alone as a boy survivor. And it was important to me to write about being a survivor and writing about masculinity, especially as a bigender person. Like I'm a bigender survivor. I'm a survivor who's a boy. I'm a survivor who's a girl. And there are different things like wrapped up in trauma and gender, and how you see yourself, and what your conception of yourself is, and how you hold on to who you are, and how you hold on to what the core of you is. For Ciela, and part of Ciela's journey in this book is reaching out to people. Like she knows she has a community who loves her. She knows she has a community that celebrates like who she is as a Latina woman and who she is as a queer young woman. She knows she has that, but she doesn't know how to talk to the people in her community about this. And that's part of her journey in this book. So some of like her touchstones to like keep her grounded, to keep her proud of herself and her body, they're very tangible, whether it's like working with the bundle, say like working with the dough, both as something that like this is something I'm making, and like I am going to eat, I am going to enjoy food, even though like my body may be curvier than the standard of what is around me. I am going to take joy in that. I'm going to take joy in red lipstick. Red lipstick is something that comes in a lot in this book. Ciela's mother says like, whatever the question, red lipstick is the answer, and that's one of the things that Ciela lives by. Like it's her power color. Like I am beautiful as I am. I am beautiful even though my body is different than what people around me would want it to be. So those things that she can touch, those things that she can work with, are sort of her first step in thinking like, okay, I'm going to talk to the people I trust, and I'm going to find out the ways in which I'm not alone, because I know that, but I'm afraid to take the steps to like really know that, if that makes any sense. And that happens with trauma. That happens with even things that are ultimately joyful, like coming out, like that step of like, okay, I need to learn that I'm not alone. I need to trust that I'm not alone. And I'm thinking about this a lot as coming out as trans and non-binary in the last couple of years.
That was beautifully said. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. Would anybody like to say anything else about your books, or just something that you didn't get to say before we wrap up?
I was just going to answer really quick. That says Holly doesn't work through her trauma in this book, but she will. So if you like that drawn out, Go get there.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Erin, Anna Marie, TJ, for joining us here at the San Diego Union-Tribune's Festival of Books. I really think that y'all have really contributed to such important representation that we need for the queer community. I would have absolutely loved to have these when I was younger, but I'm really happy that I have them now. So thank you all so much for writing these books. And please, if you're interested in purchasing the Mirror Season, Flashfire, and Magic Mutant Nightmare Girl, beautiful, fabulous covers, please visit bookshop.org/shop/SDFOB. And then please consider supporting the San Diego Council on Literacy by visiting literacysandiego.org. And you can see the full program of panels and events that we have at the sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thank you all so much again for joining us. I'm Haydee Smith from Mysterious Galaxy, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.